the Moravian mission to the Indians started as soon as they came, with sending people out, contact with Indians that knew German or English. They only went places where they were invited by Indians. They didn't believe in imposing on others. A number of missionaries like Christian Perleus went to live among the Indians, to learn their ways. David Zeisberger is not the first, but he becomes the most important of the Moravian missionaries to the Indians. What I think is very interesting is they wanted to learn from the Indians, not just teach the Indians.
One of the mission's first attempts ended in failure, while another missionary, Christian Frederick Post, was accompanying David Zeisberger to a Mohawk village. They were captured by British forces and were accused of spying for the French.
Stated reason is that he didn't have credentials to be a preacher under the laws of religion at the time. The colony of New York did not recognize the Moravian Church as a legitimate church, didn't recognize David as a minister. But the real reason was suspicion about white people having good relationship with Indians. And there was a fear that the Moravians were actually going to generate hostility of the Indians towards whites. I think there was also a fear that if the Indians knew more, they wouldn't be able to resist the whites. And this remained true throughout the period Moravians were doing missions to Indians. There was a lot of suspicion of what they were doing.
Gottlieb Spangenberg was another renowned missionary who accompanied David through the wilderness, and it is quite possible that this was the young Moravian's first real work among the Indians. David became the co-founder of the first Moravian mission, Friedenshütten, and later Gnadenhütten, as well as Shamokin, where he had previously worked as a missionary leader. When Zeisberger was staying among the Iroquois in Onondaga, the capital of the Iroquois League of the Six Nations, he slowly but gradually gained their trust and friendship.
The Onondaga allowed Zeisberger to go there to learn the language and also he was useful to them. He was useful as an intermediary with the colonial government. He was useful as an interpreter as well. But the last thing the Onondaga would allow would be a Christian mission deep in Iroquois territory. So I think Zeisberger may have had his dream of a New Jerusalem, and he understood very well how important Onondaga as a place was to the Iroquois, but it was a dream that could not possibly be realized. This was too far away from white influence, too far away from colonial settlements, too deep and too sacred to the native people to allow a mission to be started there.
Even though Zeisberger believed that one day Onondaga would become a kind of Jerusalem for the Six Nations, and was convinced that he was on the threshold of success because most of the chiefs had started to incline towards his vision, in the end, it never happened. Work in Onondaga was brought to a sudden end by the French and Indian Wars. All David Zeisberger's long and arduous efforts were shattered in almost one day. War delivered the first painful blow to the Moravian mission.
David arrived in Bethlehem just at the time when wild pro-French Indians attacked the Gnadenhütten settlement. It was a settlement about 15 miles north of Bethlehem on the river Lehigh. The inhabitants of the settlement were massacred, but about 10 missionaries and Indians managed to flee. Up until that time, the settlement had prospered and had its own mill and church, but the Indians burnt it all down. When he returned to Ohio on the river Tuscarawas, he was 76 years old, but still in full strength. He started to build new settlements. The first was called Goshen.
During the remainder of Zeisberger's life, other mission settlements grew up, and he himself believed that there was hope for a better life for the native inhabitants. There was, for example, his proposal for Ohio to become an Indian state, an idea which even reached as far as the American Congress. Unfortunately, it never came into being, and still more and more of the thousands of oppressed Native Americans drowned their helplessness in alcohol. David was aware of this, but did not give up hope. I am determined not to give up. I may be old, but God has strength enough for all. David Zeisberger, unlike other missionaries, quickly recognized the huge gulf between the Native American and European cultures. In order to bridge this gulf, he built a system that sensitively limited the differences between the lives of the wild Indians and those of Indian converts. He set down rules which the inhabitants of every mission should observe, and which, over time, he adjusted. His main principle was to lead the Indian to his own personal relationship with God, and in this he was successful.
After the defeat of the Estates Uprising, Karol the Older faced a very hectic time. He needed to attend to the matters of his own family by trying to prevent the confiscation of family possessions, as well as those of his relatives and friends. He also made efforts to help the exiles from the ranks of common people, ordinary non-Catholics. Because of the 30 Years' War, many people ran away and many were killed. Many quarters, villages and towns were burnt down or plundered, and the whole country was devastated. Under the surface of the Czech nation, many people stayed illegally devoted to the faith of their fathers, and in secret they kept reading the Kralice Bible.
An unusual time came around in the Czech countries after the Battle of White Mountain. It lasted basically for 150 years, a time covering 5 generations. It is hard to imagine that from one generation to generation, they had to pass on some kind of testimony, some spiritual legacy. It must have been difficult, as many times they had no future hope. Once it was discovered that they kept their books, gathered for services, and met in fellowship to sing or to pray, those people were persecuted, imprisoned, or even killed.
I know there are forbidden books in here. Look at that.
That is why many people abandoned all their belongings, and often it was very tragic. as they were in great danger. They were fleeing over the border and they were settling there.
There were thousands of runaways, and in the midst of that, the Kralice Bible served well. The Word of God gave people strength, comfort, and hope. It became everyday bread to the hungry and oppressed souls. At that time, the Kralice Bible became a priceless life companion to many Czechs who left the country or were forced to leave. It became a jewel. Besides personal spiritual gain, its enormous value consisted in the language Jan Blahoslav used in his translation. The Kralice translation can be compared to other brilliant European translations. Let me not forget Karl I of Liechtenstein, who I clearly remembered from the times he used to reside with Karel the Elder in the Ivančice Brethren Academy. His future, though, as we were learning later on, was to become darker and darker.
When young Karl of Liechtenstein was starting his career, no one would think that in a couple of years he would be ennobled as Duke and would become one of the most significant aristocratic figures in the country. In the end of the 16th century, something happened that Karl the Older of Žarotín later bluntly commented on. Karl of Liechtenstein flip-flopped. In today's words, he changed his political affiliation. After his conversion, Karl of Liechtenstein was appointed Moravian provincial governor for a short time. It was the first sign of the fact that his conversion wasn't just a matter of his spirituality, but that the young nobleman was destined for a future political career.
After the Battle of White Mountain, Liechtenstein was referred to as Czech Viceroy because the Emperor appointed him Czech governor.
As the Czech governor, he personified the punishment of the estates uprising, whether it was his intention or not. The truth is that, unlike other noblemen, he couldn't refuse to preside over the trial condemning the Czech rebels, and eventually also presided in the court during the execution on the Old Town Square in Prague. Liechtenstein becomes the one who would be in the following years, and even after his death in 1627, representing the defeat of the estates uprising and the punishment of its participants.
Karl I of Liechtenstein, similarly to former Emperor Ferdinand I, considered evangelical books to be very dangerous. It was forbidden to print anything without the permission of the Emperor's office. The Kralice Bible became the most dangerous and most wanted book.
When a Kralice Bible was found, it was immediately burned. It was widely feared because it was faithfully translated from original languages, and it reflected the theological disposition of the unity. It wasn't acceptable.
Karel the Elder of Žarotín personally helped many victims of persecution. He granted asylum to brethren priests, he interceded, and helped financially. Jan Amos Comenius was one of those who found asylum in his domain around Brandýs. By the way, it was there he wrote his famous Labyrinth of the World and Paradise of the Heart, which he dedicated to his patron and protector.
A very rigorous edict was released in 1628, which prohibited non-Catholics to reside on Czech territory. Despite the fact that Karl the Older was allowed by the emperor, as one of a few non-Catholics, to stay in his domain, in 1629 he decided to voluntarily leave the country for exile, along with other brothers.
Karel the Elder died in 1636, not long after his return to Moravia from Polish exile. His family couldn't afford a proper princely grave, and that is why, before long, hardly anyone remembered the sight of his remains.